Good afternoon, everyone. There's at least one empty seat up here if somebody's yearning to sit down. The carpet has been vacuumed lately, so if you need to sit, you can. But I think we're running out of space for chairs, so it's great to see such a wonderful crowd here tonight. The general series of which tonight's presentation on Charles Stang's book is simply a series to celebrate new faculty books. And it's an occasion that has been incredibly informative and enjoyable to share the work of all our colleagues as the books come out. Last year, for instance, in the spring, we had a series of books. Daniel McCannon's book, Prophetic Encounters, Religion and American Radical Tradition, David Hempton's book, The Church in the Long 18th Century, and David Carrasco's great book on the Mapa, the Mexican city book, The Cave, the City, and the Eagle's Nest. And by the time we hear a series of these presentations, you do get a wonderful feel of what's going on in the study of religion, theology, and related fields. So it's been a very exciting series. And an occasion when we're so busy and have so many things going on to see what are the fruits of those labor of faculty early in the morning and late at night and those hidden weekends and those long summers when people seem to disappear. People are doing their research and wonderful fruits come out of it. And now we see the results and the fruits of all that time. We do have a number of such more book events coming up this year, and just to highlight one of them, there'll be probably at least 4 more. Stephanie Paul-Sell and Harvey Cox contributed an unusual pair to a volume in the Westminster John Knox series of commentaries on the Bible for pastors and those preaching, Lamentations and the Song of Songs. Lamentations by Harvey and the Song of Songs by Stephanie. And we'll have 2 food setups, one for those who are rejoicing in the love, and dust and ashes for those who are lamenting. So come early, decide which side you're on. And that's on October 30th at this time, so please do come for that. But we're very happy today, without further ado, to celebrate Charles Stang's new book, Apophasis and Pseudonymity in Dionysius the Areopagite, No Longer I. I will, in a moment, pass the book around to take a look. It's a wonderful book that I think will open a wonderful discussion for us today. Our procedure will be, I'll just say a word introducing Charles Stang, and then he will speak to us about how he came to write the book. What goes on when you choose a topic, how do you make your decisions about what fits the book, what's in the book, and what was it that excited him about this project. After he's finished speaking for 15, 20 minutes, whatever, then I'll introduce our 2 discussants for the book. They will speak 15, 20 minutes, and then Charles will have an opportunity to speak again on any questions that they may have raised before opening it for discussion. So our author tonight is Charles Stang, a well-known member of our faculty, who received his BA in philosophy here at Harvard in 1997, his MDiv at the University of Chicago, 2001, and finished his THD in theology here in 2008. At that point in 2008, he also joined our faculty, and his research and teaching focus on the history and theology of Christianity in late antiquity, especially Eastern varieties of Christianity. Specifically, he is interested in the development of ascetical, monastic, and mystical traditions in the Eastern Christian world. Has done work and sponsored speakers also on the Silk Road, the spread of Nestorian Christianity in particular over into China even, and opening up quite exciting possibilities to the East. In addition to today's book, Charles is also the editor of The Waking Dream of T.E. Lawrence, Essays on His Life, Literature, and Legacy, and with Sarah Coakley, Rethinking Dionysius the Areopagite. It came out in 2009. And with Zachary Giuliano, The Open Body, Essays in Anglican Ecclesiology. His current projects include a new book that he's working on called The Divine Double, which traces a tradition from antiquity according to which each individual has a divine double, a counterpart or a twin, whom one can meet and with whom one then forms a sort of bi-unity. The early Christian witness to this topic will be central to the book, but other chapters will deal with Plato, the Manichaeans, Plotinus, and other versions of this in the ancient Near East. And a second project is a new edition and translation of Evagrius of Pontus's Gnostic trilogy, which survives partly in Greek and entirely in Syriac and Armenian. And that will be published by Oxford University Press. So it looks like we can schedule Charles for at least 2 more book events in the next couple of years, perhaps. These will be available to us. But tonight, Charles will speak to us of his most recent book, Apophasis and Pseudonymity, and Dionysius the Areopagite. So let us welcome Charles.
Thank you all for coming. Thanks especially to Frank for hosting this event, and to the CSWR staff, especially Lexi Gewurtz for putting this whole thing together. Thank you, Lexi. And I'd also really like to thank Nicholas Watson and David Brakke for coming, in Nicholas's case, across the yard, and in David's case, from Ohio, to respond to this book. So Frank's asked me to speak on the topic of how I came to write this book. And in order to do that, I need to back up to 1998. But I won't narrate continuously my life from 1998. But in the fall of 1998, I began an MDiv at the University of Chicago. And I had planned, I started that degree thinking I would study modern philosophy and theology. That was my focus as an undergraduate. But in the spring of that first year, David Tracy and Jean-Luc Marion offered a course on negative theology. Marion was, at that time, periodically visiting the University of Chicago from Paris. And I saw this in the catalog, and I thought, frankly, what the hell is negative theology? And that occasioned all sorts of really lame jokes among the students, which you can probably imagine. But I had, of course, never heard of the term negative theology. Perhaps some of you haven't either. But what was curious is that it came to serve as a sort of spine that connected what seemed to me at the time to be disparate interests of mine. It sort of connected these into something of a single body. I'm going to give you a definition of negative theology because I just recently had to write one. So I'm going to test drive it with you tonight. Negative theology is a name given to a tradition within Christianity that confesses God to be so utterly transcendent, so beyond our concepts and names for God, that we must in fact negate them in order to free God from such cramped categories. Negative, in Latin negativa, as in the via negativa, is a translation of the Greek word apophatikos from apophasis, sometimes rendered unsaying, but more often simply negation. Negative theology is often, but not always, mystical theology, because its negations are explicitly in the service of soliciting an encounter with this transcendent God. By negating our concepts and names for God, so it is believed, we clear space within ourselves so that God can appear, so to speak, as God. That is, as the mystery God is and must be in order to be properly God. Thus, negative theology proceeds on the assumption that the way we speak to and about God conditions the possibility of our having a mystical encounter with God. Okay. Without delving too much into spiritual autobiography, I will say that negative theology delivered for me a credible Christianity. Now, back to that course with David Tracy and Jean-Luc Marion. Our first reading was Pseudo-Dionysius. Dionysius the Areopagite. And my first reaction, not unlike my first reaction to negative theology, is, pardon my crudeness, who the hell is this? You might have a sense of who I was at 23, that was my reaction to anything I didn't know about. How could this can't possibly be important? I don't know about it already. So for those of you who are also perhaps don't know this, for whom Pseudo-Dionysius is not a household name, let me say a few words about him or about this corpus. In the early 6th century in Syria, there began to circulate a collection of texts that were attributed to a certain Dionysius, a member of the court of the Areopagus in Athens, who was said in Acts of the Apostles, book 17, to have been converted by Paul's famous speech to the Areopagus, in which he speaks of the unknown God. Now, when I say that this corpus was attributed to Dionysius, that's not exactly right. it's not that we have a corpus of writings that was attributed to a first century Christian. Someone writes as if they are Dionysius the Areopagite, through and through. The corpus is written in a series of 4 treatises and 10 letters to other early Christians, and references are made to the life of this figure Dionysius. So that's what suddenly appeared on the scene in early 6th century, although no writings had ever been associated with that particular figure prior to that. As you can imagine, its reception was somewhat contested, but by the end of the 6th century, its advocates had won out over its skeptics. That is, it was regarded as an authentic first century text. It was only in the late 19th century that was proved false, that in fact this text could not have been written by a first century author because he borrows extensively from 5th century Athenian Neoplatonism, and rather baldly, frankly. So it's as if someone, there's terminology in this book. It's as if someone used the word astronaut and was passing themselves off as Shakespeare. It is very odd terminology that would seem to date the work from our perspective. But in any case, let me back up and say, after the first lecture on this text, I thought, okay, clearly my education is deficient, and I need to find out who this Dionysius the Areopagite is. So I scrawled in the front page the passage from Acts 17, and this seems sort of strangely providential, because, as I'll say more about in a moment, I've been coming back to this passage for about 10 years. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this corpus, it amounts to the most developed mystical theology in the first millennium of Christianity, and one that came to exert an enormous influence on both the Greek, Latin, and Syriac mystical traditions. And you could very well tell the history of Christian mysticism by telling the reception of this book. You would miss some things, but you wouldn't miss a lot. So that's some sense of the significance of this very small corpus for the history of Christian mysticism. Okay, so I finished my degree at Harvard. At Chicago. I came back to Harvard to start the THD, and in my first semester here, I was in a reading group with Nicholas Constas, who was formerly on the faculty, and that was my first encounter with this corpus in Greek. Which is difficult, to say the least, dense, crabbed Greek, the sort of Greek that even when you've analyzed it, it's not at all clear what it means. But what was clear was how much the author was drawing on the Apostle Paul. So I approached it with, I had certain questions as I was reading it more deeply this time than my first exposure. I wanted to know why this author wrote under a pseudonym, and why this pseudonym, why an apostolic pseudonym, and why this figure Dionysius the Areopagite. Now, I was fully expecting that this and other related questions would be among the first topics treated in secondary literature, and so I was sort of astonished to discover that there was almost no interest in the pseudonym. So the prevailing view of the pseudonym in scholarship was that this author wrote it as a sort of mercenary means to protect himself in an age of anxious orthodoxies. This is in the 6th century when the Eastern Roman Empire is being torn apart by the Christological controversies. So a means to protect himself by hiding his identity, and perhaps to secure a wider readership by having an apostolic name attached to the corpus. And people would dismiss the references to Paul as, along the same lines, a sort of apostolic cover for his real commitments, which were to Neoplatonism. So what I found instead was an ongoing debate in the scholarly world, but a debate as to whether Dionysius was really a Christian or really a Neoplatonist. And there were sides. I'm not going to name any names. And there were people who, I don't want to present myself as the only one who questioned that framing of it, but that was a predominant frame. And it always struck me as something of an odd question to ask of the corpus. I was thinking today, what if one were to ask of Paul Tillich, is he a Christian or is he an existentialist? They don't seem like they are equivalent or sort of opposing terms. Or if you were to ask of Herman Cohen, is he Jewish or is he a Kantian? It doesn't make sense. And I wondered whether it wasn't the same actually in late antiquity. It's not entirely fair to say that it wasn't that the question of Christianity over and against Neoplatonism was foreign to that world, because at least since the 4th century there was a very lively debate as to whether Christianity could lay claim to the pre-Christian classical past, and if they did, how they could. And much of that debate was occasioned by the short reign of the Emperor Julian the Apostate, but that's another book. So I sat down when it came to dissertating to write on this book, and I wanted to explore this question of pseudonymity in Paul. The book, as it stands, falls into 2 parts. In the first part, I wanted to just open up the question about pseudonymous writing. So I started looking at scholarship on ancient pseudonymous writing. Surprisingly, no one had thought to read this corpus in light of the vast amount of pseudonymous writing in antiquity. Jews, Christians, and others were writing under pseudonyms for several centuries, actually a full millennium. I also wanted to think about how Christians in late antiquity related to the apostles, and how they thought about time, and whether and how it could be crossed or traversed. And I wanted to think about how Christians regarded holy men and women as icons of Christ, whom they could imitate, and in so imitating, actually imitate Christ himself. So, at the end of section 2, I concluded with this passage, which I'll read to you. The widespread conviction that time was porous or could be collapsed led to different practices of writing meant to bridge that temporal divide, including hagiography and homiletics. I used 2 case studies, John Chrysostom and something called the Life and Acts of Thecla. I argue that the pseudonymous enterprise of the corpus is another writing practice meant to bridge this same divide, to collapse the centuries so that the late ancient writer could achieve contemporaneity with the apostolic past, not by summoning it forward in time, but by traveling back in time and assuming the identity of one of the disciples. So, based on that, if in fact the author is, in a sense, traveling back in time and assuming the identity of a disciple of Paul, then we'd expect that the life, letters, and legacy of Paul would influence the major themes of this work, of this mystical theology. And as a result, in part 2, I tried to chart that influence. That is, how Paul is crucial for understanding the major themes of this mystical theology, which themes include Dionysius' notion of hierarchy and deification. By the way, he coins the term hierarchy. Dionysius' understanding of mystical union as unknowing, agnosia, and how, according to Dionysius, the relationship of Christian revelation, what is the relationship of Christian revelation to pagan wisdom, especially Greek philosophy. In other words, I thought the corpus actually told us how Christianity and Greek philosophy were supposed to relate, even though scholars had very strong views about that. I regarded the corpus as actually having its own internal view. And most importantly, I was interested in what Dionysius understood to be I called it apophatic anthropology. And what I meant by that is how the self that's united to the unknown God is also rendered unknown. To put that another way, how the process of uniting to the unknown God is an exercise of becoming unknown to oneself, and how. What's that process look like? And for those of you who know the corpus, you'll know that this process of unknowing involves eros, ecstasy, and madness. And I was keen to show how Dionysius looks to Paul as the premier witness of that event. And he leans very heavily on one passage, Galatians 2:20. It is no longer I, but Christ who lives in me. That no longer I does a tremendous amount of work for this author. And in fact, I tried to title the book No Longer I, but Oxford University Press objected. And so you have this unfelicitous monster that we have before us, and has precluded Oprah Winfrey ever calling me for a book deal. The biggest surprise, it was close. I think had I gotten No Longer I think I would have had a fair shot. The biggest surprise of writing the book was a hypothesis that pseudonymous writing is in fact integral to the aims of the mystical theology. And what I mean by that is that writing in such a way that you are one and yet two, or in the words of the mystical theology, that's one of the texts, the mystical theology, neither oneself nor someone else. That the writing actually is an exercise in the service of opening the self to the indwelling of Christ. And this stands as something of a hypothesis in the book, from which I'll read in a moment, which I have developed a little bit in other, a little bit more in other venues, including the forthcoming. Amy, is it forthcoming? It's out. It's out. The Cambridge Companion to Christian Mysticism. I have an essay in there on writing, which is an attempt to sort of look at how writing is conceived of as a mystical exercise in Christianity beyond this figure. So I'll conclude by reading just the last few, a paragraph of that, not the last few paragraphs, a single paragraph of the book, and then saying just a brief word about what I wish I had done better. Nothing. That's the short answer. It's perfect. Okay. I submit that for Dionysius, the very practice of writing under a pseudonym is no mere ploy for sub-apostolic authority and thereby a wider readership, but is in fact an ecstatic devotional practice in the service of the negation of the self, and thereby of soliciting deifying union with the unknown God. Pseudonymous writing renders the self neither oneself nor someone else. That is to say, somehow both oneself and someone else. In the case of the author of this corpus, he is both himself, an anonymous writer from the early 6th century, and also someone else, Dionysius the Areopagite. Pseudonymous writing is for our author a practice that stretches the self to the point that it splits, renders the self unsaid, that is, unseated from its knowing center, unknown to itself, and so better placed, because displaced, to suffer union with, quote, him who has placed darkness as his hiding place. But this is no arbitrary doubling. The other with whom the self must now share its space is a disciple of Paul, Dionysius, a disciple who follows Paul's mimetic imperative, quote, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. And Paul, by his own admission in Galatians 2:20, is already doubled. He is both Paul and Christ. Only through the negation, but not the denial of the single self, what Paul calls the I, only through unknowing oneself can one clear space in the self for the indwelling of the other. In short, our pseudonymous author offers an account of what it is to be properly human in relation to God, namely, no longer an I, neither yourself nor someone else, because you are now both yourself and Christ. And in the very telling, he performs an exercise aiming to render his own self cleft open, split, doubled, and thereby deified. So it's that hypothesis that concludes the book. And I'll just say a word now about what I would explore further if I had time. Funny enough, it's time. I'm fascinated by, I moved quickly over the question of time in the book, and given some of the stuff I have read subsequent, and in fact I'm reading now, I would love to return to the topic of time, both perhaps looking to Proclus's philosophy of time to see if in fact there was a contemporary philosophical justification for this kind of time travel, which I'm imputing to this author, And also, given my argument that this is that writing is an exercise for achieving contemporaneity with the past, whether writing can also be conceived of as a practice of achieving contemporaneity with the future, which is another way of saying, can writing be eschatological? I'll leave it there. I'm sure that David and Nicholas will have more interesting things to say, but thank you for your time, and now on to you.
Thank you, Charles. Some of you don't realize that that's not his real name, Charles Stang. It's actually a pseudonym, and if you stay long enough, we'll tell you at the end. We are very, one of the lovely parts of these events is to have two discussants who will think through issues raised in the book and take about 15, 20 minutes each to open the discussion, to raise some questions, to explore further the issues that come up in the book, having heard from the author first. And we're very grateful today to have two illustrious discussants for the book. David Brakke will go first. David Brakke is the Joe R. Engle Chair of the History of Christianity and Professor of History at Ohio State University. He received his BA in English from the University of Virginia, his Master's of Divinity here at Harvard, and PhD in Religious Studies at Yale. David studies the history and literature of ancient Christianity up through the 5th century. His interests are wide, but focus on asceticism, Gnosticism, monasticism, and Christianity in Egypt. He has published widely in numerous books, including, just to give you a few examples, Athanasius and the Politics of Asceticism, 1995, Demons and the Making of the Monk, Spiritual Combat in Early Christianity, 2006, and his latest monograph is called The Gnostics, Myth, Ritual, and Diversity in Early Christianity, and this was named a Choice Outstanding Academic Title in 2011. He is currently a member of the international team of scholars who are producing the first unified critical edition and translation of the works of Shenouda of Atripe, the greatest native writer of Coptic, and the leader of a monastic community in Upper Egypt in the 4th and 5th century. And on top of all that, he is president-elect of the International Association of Coptic Studies. Our second respondent is from closer by here, as Charles mentioned, Nicholas Watson, come over from the Yard. Nicholas is professor of English and American literature and language here at Harvard, and is the English department's director of graduate studies and chair of the Medieval Studies Committee. He earned his BA and MA from Cambridge University, a master's in philosophy at Oxford, and a PhD from the University of Toronto. He is an internationally known medievalist whose principal interests lie in Christian religious text written in Middle English and Anglo-Norman French, the vernacular of the day. And to give you an idea of his writing, just a couple of recent works. 1999, he was a co-author of a volume entitled The Idea of the Vernacular, an anthology of Middle English literary theory, 1280 to 1520. In 2003, The Vulgar Tongue, Medieval and Post-Medieval Vernacularities, and 2000, Desire for the Past, and also co-edited a volume entitled The Writings of Julian of Norwich, A Vision Showed to a Devout Woman and a Revelation of Love. And he is currently, or perhaps it's finished by now, not sure, writing a book tentatively called Balaam's Ass, Vernacular Theology and Literary History, England, 1050 to 1550. So we have two wonderful discussants, and I believe that David will go first. Welcome.
First, I too would like to thank the center and the staff for arranging this. It's really great to be here. I was thinking the last time I was in this room was to talk about Karen King's book, What is Gnosticism, which is now 8 or 9 years ago, which is kind of strange. And then I was talking with Frank Clooney because this is a really nice place, and when I was a student, it wasn't very nice. And in the 1980s, but before that, the last time I've been here, just to kind of give you a sense of how ancient this is, was a party to celebrate the tenure of Margaret Miles, the first woman to receive tenure at Harvard Div School. So that's really We've come a long way. This is a really great book. So first, let me tell you why it's really good, and you should go and read it, like immediately. Do not wait. Go and do it. First of all, and the most basic reason is you can actually understand it. And it's about Pseudo-Dionysius, which I'll just tell you, that's a big achievement in and of itself, to write a book about Pseudo-Dionysius that people can actually understand. And so anyone interested in mysticism should read this, and you'll learn from it. Second, and this just kind of builds on what Charlie was describing of the book, he really unsettles an opposition between Christianity and Neoplatonism, which has plagued the study of later antiquity, which is part of a tendency in early Christian studies to stop putting people, identities, and texts into neat and separate boxes. It also undermines any notion of an essential Christianity, or for that matter, an essential Neoplatonism, which has been equally plagued by that. We could talk more about this, but it's interesting to compare it to the Tillich question, because that raises the question of to what extent I think Platonism was a community in later antiquity in the way, of course, existentialism never was. And that would be, we could have that conversation, and there are people in the room who would help us with that. Next, really great reassessment of pseudonymity as a writing practice. I suggest we should all just set this against Bart Ehrman's Forged. That's the title of the book, right? Which is soon to appear in a more scholarly version than the popular Forged that is out there. Charlie's perspective, identification with the other as an ascetic practice of self-splitting and self-effacement, links up with earlier apocalyptic literature, I think, whether Jewish or Christian, and I think it really provides an interesting entree into thinking about some Gnostic literature such as Zostrianus. But I won't go down that path, but we could talk about that because I have another path I want to go down. It's really, as far as I know, but I am not an expert in mysticism, the first really extended discussion of the idea of an apophasis of the self, or apophatic anthropology, which are terms that, this idea that the mystic must unknow him or herself in the process of knowing God. I think this term has sometimes been thrown around in the scholarship as a kind of idea, but not really explored in full. And of course, as he said, it's very possible Dionysius is really source for this kind of notion that you see in later authors, but I don't know anything about that. But I want to focus today on the self that we unknow and that we split or open up through the practice of pseudonymity. What is the self for Pseudo-Dionysius? Is there even a self? Because some people would argue that in late antiquity and before modernity, there's really no concept of the self, which I don't think is true. I edited a book, Religion and the Self in Antiquity, therefore there must be such a thing because there's a whole book about it. But nonetheless, I'm just going to say that it is, that I don't agree with that, but anyway. So to get at this, and I'm going to put out a hypothesis of what the self is in Pseudo-Dionysius that then Charlie can tell me why it's wrong or right or whatever. But to get at that, I'm going to use a few comparisons to get at this. Augustine of Hippo, Hadwick of Brabant, I hope I said that right, because I know nothing about her, as you'll learn. And finally, Bruce Springsteen. And I thought I'd start with Bruce, because that way I get the part you're not going to respect me for first. So this is, and all of this comes from when you read a book when you're reading other things. That's the thing, because I never would have noticed this before. So there's a long profile of Bruce in a New Yorker from July. And I'm so far behind, and I don't know if anyone else has this experience in my New Yorkers that, of course, I'm reading notes and comments that have to do with like years ago or whatever. So I was reading this while I'm reading this book, and here's Bruce talking. This is him speaking. My issues weren't as obvious as drugs. Mine were different. They were quieter, just as problematic, but quieter. With all artists, because of the undertow of history and self-loathing, there's a tremendous push towards self-obliteration that occurs on stage. It's both things. There's a tremendous finding of the self, while also an abandonment of the self at the same time. You are free of yourself for those hours. All the voices in your head are gone, just gone. There's one voice, the voice you're speaking in. Okay, that's end quote. Elsewhere, he talks about himself in concert as being a conduit for the energy and anxieties and feelings of the crowd, which Charlie didn't really say this, but this is a key part of his argument, that this splitting of the self is also not just about Christ just kind of occupying you, but you being a conduit for Christ, who is the energy that moves through the hierarchies in which we all exist. So it was kind of interesting to me for that resonance. Now, there's a lot to be said about this quote from the man from New Jersey, but here's also a split self, but one that's entirely internal to the self. Right? It feels very modern to me. It's not about identifying with a god or a person from the past, like Dionysius or whatever. Rather, the self that one obliterates or abandons is a set of multiple voices in your head, the anxieties and self-condemnations that are yourself but actually plague you. The self one finds, for Bruce, is a single voice, he says, the voice you're speaking in, presumably the kind of lovable, authentic self that those voices oppose and don't permit you to see. This voice is both you and a conduit for the energy of everyone at the concert. So, again, to compare this to Pseudo-Dionysius' idea that the energy of Christ pulses through hierarchies, through individual persons. Now, what Bruce is talking about sounds very spontaneous, cathartic, ecstatic, so forth and so on. But in fact, as I learned from this article, Springsteen meticulously rehearses every moment in a concert. What he'll say between songs, when he'll raise his fist, even the way he looks in the spotlight at the end of a particularly great song. So this abandonment and finding of the self is precisely choreographed. It is trained for and planned. It doesn't just happen. Likewise, the splitting of the self and yearning for God that Pseudo-Dionysius practices is similarly meticulous. It's tied to a meticulously crafted pseudonymity, and that pushes that practice to the extreme, as Charlie described. On the one hand, careful and elaborate construction of a pseudo-self we have. On the one hand, he writes letters, he refers to specific events and people. I was at Mary's house the other day. I mean, it's very, circumstantial, specific about it. On the other hand, there's little effort to hide his real context in the early 5th century. Undisguised quotations from recent Neoplatonist authors, references to liturgy in his day, not what happened back in the old times, etc. This extremity of pseudonymity, I want to call it, pushing both sides, it's me, but it's not me, simultaneously is what contributes to this self-vacating that allows the energy that is Christ to run through him. Charlie shows good precedents in the life and miracles of St. Thecla and John Chrysostom, and also in Paul himself for this. I just want to note as an aside, because my New Testament-y person wants to say, is that this reading of Paul's a mystic seems to at times be as much a reading of Paul in the book as of Dionysius, which I kind of found fun and recalled for me Schweitzer's mysticism of Paul the Apostle. Which you might want. Did you read that book?
No, not in preparation. I have read it, but not
But anyway, but for Schweitzer, Paul's mysticism stems only from his Jewish apocalyptic eschatology. It is not Hellenistic at all. Anticipating the very Christian versus Neoplatonist distinction regarding Dionysius that Stang dismantles. But in fact, I would look to Gnostic works like Zostrianos and Allogenes the Foreigner for the real fusion of Jewish apocalypticism and Platonizing contemplation that we later find in Pseudo-Dionysius. I really just think thanks to Zeke Measure, we're seeing this, that it's just all there. But the Gnostics don't have the whole eros thing going on, I would say, but people can disagree with me. Okay. The element of eros or desire inherited from Plato brings me to my second comparison, Augustine. Obviously, I could take a book to do this, but I only have a couple minutes, so let me make brief schematic thoughts. Augustine's self, I would say, as Charles Taylor puts it, is an interior space that can be explored. Its memory contains the particulars of my life and experience, traces of God's presence and shepherding of me from my birth. I suggest that in Augustine one unites with God by a different form of splitting, not an unknowing of the self, but a radical knowing of it. What Taylor calls this radical reflexivity, by knowing myself as the image of God, as one who knows and loves himself. In all of the Trinity, which, you can say Augustine really isn't a mystic, but in which I'm actually willing to entertain, so that this is not a fair comparison. And the Trinity isn't really about mysticism, it's about the Trinity, yes, so forth and so on. But all that having said, it's interesting that in that book, which is massive, Augustine never quotes that part of Galatians 2:20 that forms the theme of Stang's book. It's no longer I who live, by Christ who lives me. And I started to but it was Saturday morning, and I was here, and I didn't have my books on my shelf, but I was like, now I want to find this in Augustine, somewhere. I want to find what he would do with this. And even at Ostia, when Augustine shares a memorable experience of transcendence with his mother Monica, they reach eternal wisdom by, he says, entering their own minds. As with his fellow Platonist, Pseudo-Dionysius, Augustine's mysticism is motivated by love, but the ecstatic love that shatters the self in Pseudo-Dionysius appears, I think, rather rarely in Augustine. Rather, Augustine's love is a kind of continual engine of the self, attaching it to temporal and material goods when it's misguided, but also guiding the self to itself in God, when it moves rightly. So love leads me to my third comparison, this time with Hadwick of Brabant, who I just even learned how to pronounce her name. The 13th century Beguine. I know next to nothing about Hadwick, and all I know is because Amy Hollywood told me some things at tea this morning, so that's right. But I had to read some excerpts from her work in teaching my undergraduate survey of the history of Christianity this semester. And in one of her visions, Hadwick sees herself and St. Augustine as two eagles, which are both devoured by a phoenix. Hadwick and Augustine are united in their love for the beloved, their unity depicted in their feathers, which depict their respective youth and age combined. The feathers are kind of traded, it's complicated. But anyway, the phoenix represents the unity of the Trinity in which both Hadwick and Augustine are lost. You know, she used that word. We are lost in the love of the Trinity and so on. And that devouring by the phoenix kind of represents this. Like our 6th century author, Hadwick identifies with an authoritative Christian from the past, but Augustine is changed as much by Hadwick as she is by him, for Augustine's feathers represent the renewed splendor that he gains from Hadwick, who loves Augustine deeply and shares with Augustine the desire that they love the Trinity with a single love. Moreover, Hadwick, however, then asks to be removed from this union with Augustine, for she wants to, as she puts it, belong to God alone in pure love. She doesn't want the security of union with another creature. Rather, she is herself, she says, a free human creature who can desire freely with her own will and will as highly as she wishes. Now, to be sure, Hadwick couches all this in the language of humility and poverty. I can't do this because I'm not a saint, so forth and so on. But she articulates herself in the remarkably modern language of freedom, the assertion of the individual will, and union with other saints only on the basis of her own individual repose with God, not the other way around. She talks about love constantly. It's at the center of her spirituality. She seems to be in love with it as much as with God, and yet she worries about the loss of self that passionate love can involve. Loss of self to other creatures, if not to God. So when I return to Pseudo-Dionysius and his conception of the self from these examples, I find myself at something of a loss, as I have often found in exploring the same theme of the self in Evagrius Ponticus, who is another fascination I share with Charlie, who is some 2 centuries earlier. Springsteen, Augustine, Hadwick speak of the self in terms of interiority, individuality, the will, and freedom, language that resonates with me as a product of the modern Christian West. I feel like their selves and myself is somehow similar, if not, Both Evagrius and Pseudo-Dionysius seem to me to think of the self in more open terms. Like Augustine and Hadwick, they talk of love, but here love seems to be a continual openness to the energy and influence of another. Toward the end of his book, Charlie wrestles with chapter 11 of the Divine Names, where Pseudo-Dionysius says that creatures should not lose their individuality, in Greek, idiotetos, which Stang rightly, I think, understands as their place in the hierarchy of beings. Creatures, Charlie tells us, must consent both to staying in their place, their individuality, and to being displaced in that place by the energy of Christ. Likewise, in chapter 8, Pseudo-Dionysius defines salvation as, quote, that which preserves all things in their proper places without change, conflict, or collapse toward evil, that it keeps them all in peaceful and untroubled obedience to their proper laws, that it expels all inequality and interference from the world, and that it gives everything the proportion to avoid turning into its own opposite and to keep free of any kind of change of state. This self seems to me, so here's my hypothesis, which could be just totally wrong. This self seems to me a location, a point on a 3-dimensional graph, or a node on an electronic grid. There's nothing in the point. Its location, the larger scheme it serves to map, and the reality to which it is oriented and whose energy it conducts, that's everything. To the extent that this will asserts itself as a self, it does so pseudonymously, gosh, I could say that, as another, as open to a power that it transmits and does so effectively only in its assigned place. As the author creates himself as Dionysius, I think he does so most thoroughly by placing himself in a network of Christians. It's all about my relationships with these people, and I'm writing letters to them and so forth and so on, mostly associated with Paul through these letters, for example. So I wonder, and you can tell me whether I'm right, whether I have the pseudo-Dionysian self right, or I'm on a path, or I don't know. I wonder especially about whether this is right, because it seems to resonate so well with some brands of structuralist and post-structuralist thought, in which the self is all surface and not depth, in which our body selves take their characters from their positions in a larger network of language and power that operates through their positions in a larger network that operates through us more than by our individual agency, in which self-fashioning and positioning of the self are the primary options, and in which meaning is created through relationships and structures rather than through what inheres in any single word, symbol, or self, just as they are in their own idiotes or individuality. Okay, so these are some of the inarticulate musings that this rich and deeply learned book provoked in me, and for that I'm very grateful. So, thank you.
Thank you for this. Thank you for this chance to come and meet with everybody today. It's great. And this is a wonderful thing which we should be doing more in the yard than we are. I'm going to be very inchoate. I want to talk about time travel, which is one of the themes of Charles's book, and to really phrase my one question for Charles's book in relation to that. But I thought I'd start because I come at Pseudo-Dionysius from the viewpoint mostly as a scholar of the end of the Middle Ages, of the 14th and 15th centuries particularly. I thought I'd start with one encounter between that period and Dionysius that I hadn't really thought about in the same way until I read Charles's book. And this is in Julian of Norwich's Revelation of Love. Julian looking at the cross, suffering as she looks at it, as she sees the suffering, remarks at one point that in doing that, she's attempting a kind of renewal of the moment of the passion itself. She wants to be in that time with others that were Christ's lovers. And as she sees Christ not quite dying, but nearly dying on the cross, she remarks that the whole creation was in pain at the same time as Christ was in pain. And she gives evidence for this traditionally of the earthquake that took place at the time of the crucifixion. All creatures that might suffer pain suffered with him. That is to say, all creatures that God has made to our service, the firmament and the earth, failed for sorrow in their kind in the time of Christ's dying. And those that were his friends suffered pain for love. She's thinking mostly of the Virgin Mary, but also of the apostles. And generally all, that is to say, those that knew him suffered for failing of every kind of comfort, and those who knew him not also suffered. And she gives two examples then of two people who knew him not, who also suffered. One was Pilate, Pontius Pilate, and the other was Saint Dionysius of France. That's Dionysius the Areopagite, which was at that time a Paynim. For when he saw wonders and marvels, sorrows and dreads that befell in that time, he said, either the world is now at an end, or else he that is maker of kinds, the creator of nature, suffers. Wherefore he did write on an altar, this is an altar of the unknown God. And there, of course, the story intersects, or the story which is actually sprung out of probably Jacobus of Origenes' Golden Legend, intersects back with the story of Acts, because it's when Paul, of course, comes to Athens that he starts his sermon with the altar of the unknown God. And in medieval legend, Dionysius is the guy who has set up the altar of the unknown God not that many years before, because he's so curious to know about what went on when the earth failed at the time of the Passion. Julian, I had never thought until this point about whether Julian was actually attempting a kind of literary homage at this point. I've always thought it was quite possible she knew Dionysius in various forms, and that she knew the name and she knew basically the basic set of ideas. But it seemed to me that this is a piece of time travel of her own that I thought was extremely suggestive in relation to what Charles was writing about for time travel. Charles takes us a long way into the world of Dionysius, and as David said, he does so very clearly and very richly, and we get a sense of philological closeness, we get a sense of how particular kind of local cultural and intellectual traditions work as we work our way into the book. And this analysis of how Dionysius is thinking, as it were, on the ground, which is conducted really brilliantly through philological analysis through the second half of the book, is the thing that I found most sort of exciting as a scholar. I also found brushing up against things that I know quite well in a 14th century context, in a 5th and 6th century context, fascinating for the way that the categories both don't line up and do line up all the time. Hierarchy versus ecstasy. Hierarchy and ecstasy. Hierarchy as ecstasy doesn't compute in the 14th century. Hierarchy here, ecstasy there. I'm trained to think that what happened in the late 14th century was that in the 13th and 14th centuries was that people gradually got Dionysius more and more wrong, because they moved from, as they kind of invented the idea of affectivity, we moved from a kind of intellectual assent to God to an emotional assent to God. Completely wrong. Just has nothing to do with the facts on the ground. It seems to me now that the late 14th century, in fact, the whole tradition of Dionysian commentary from Gallus in the early 13th century onwards is actually doing something more like rediscovering the real Dionysius by, as modern scholarship thinks, traducing it. And this brings me on to the kind of central set of things I wanted to say. Charles's book is about 100 years in, about 115 years into what we could call critical scholarship on Pseudo-Dionysius. Critical scholarship being the body of scholarship that names Dionysius pseudo. This starts in the 1890s, as Charles helpfully tells us, with a simultaneous publication of two books by Hugo Koch and Josef Siegelmeier, which both, in similar terms, disprove the possibility Dionysius could have been anything other than pseudo. This is, of course, the moment of the higher criticism in biblical studies. It's the moment of the rise of an objectivist scholarship, an attempt to align philological scholarship with the scientific. And that is a starting moment which Charles goes to, although it's rather nice that he comes at it by looking at some 6th century scholars first and sort of folding them in. And the pseudo that is created at that point is correct. It's unquestionable. We have no way of getting away from that pseudo. We can never rediscover a primal world in which Dionysius is just himself. So the book accepts that premise, because it has to, and it wants to, but it's also written out of the premise that there's something wrong. That the moment at which Dionysius enters the modern era for readers is a moment when something huge is lost, as well as being gained. Charles's analysis of the scholarship over the last 60 or so years, say since the Second World War, is actually the analysis of an attempt both to explore the new late antique landscape within which Dionysius actually wrote, but also, I think, he analyzes an attempt to recuperate some of the loss that comes into a study of Dionysius from the higher criticism. His own book is an attempt to overcome that loss, to take that loss and in some way annihilate it, to restore us to a Dionysius fully inhabiting his own identity. And to put very badly what Charles actually already read from his ending, to restore that sense of Dionysius as having an identity cleft open, split, doubled, and therefore deified by his decision to subsume itself into the identity of another, to travel across time, and to be Dionysius of Athens. So the pseudo is healed in Charles's book. He actually heals, as it were, the reft made between traditions of reading Dionysius reverently as a sub-apostolic author and the present that is the product of higher critical thought since the 1890s onwards. Now this process, this healing process that Charles attempt is, of course, itself involves a sort of time travel. The kind of time travel that scholarship has had to learn to do in the wake of the higher criticism and the divide between the present and the past, the sense of an absolute divide between present and past that the higher criticism brought with it. Sympathetic historical evaluation, an insistence on treating the past in its own terms, a close reading that is not quite scientific but critical. Charles, these are some of the tools that he brings to bear on this. Charles doesn't say this, but his project involves its own kind of apophasis. It's actually one of my questions for Charles, is what kind of apophasis do you think you perform, and do you think we perform as scholars when we work in this kind of mode? All of us who have to study the deep past have to learn to perform something of this kind. What is apophatic about it? Well, in a broad sense, I think the kind of mode in which Charles is working is apophatic because it requires us to subordinate the present and its purposes to the past and an understanding of its purposes. The higher criticism wanted to separate the true from the false. It wanted very badly to find the historical Jesus, good luck with that one, and it wanted to sort out what could reliably be brought into the present in the sense of being made foundational for the new order that it was coming to call modernity. The higher criticism, therefore, like most 19th century historical scholarship, was teleological to its core. In the very places where it denies it's teleological, it's being most teleological. Now, Charles brings us something in a very different vein. Do we learn about our own present, about the long centuries between then and now from his book? Well, perhaps we do. Perhaps the study of the past always does that. But this isn't the point of the book. The point of the book is to subsume this present into a sense of the past. And this here produces me a kind of crisis in this book, and a crisis in all books which have got a confessional or a kind of reverential attitude to the material that they study. If I can, Charles, you said it yourself. So you said this is the author that made sense of Christianity to you. There's only one or two places in the book that you could have put that. You could have put that in the acknowledgements. You could probably have smuggled it into the index. But you could not have put it in the body of the book. And that is a sign of the continuing vital gap between the scholarly world we inherit from the higher criticism and the world that it displaced. So the protocols of Charles's mode of time travel are those of contemporary scholarship. It requires close comparative reading, the construction and interpretation of an archive, a close sense of genre, and awareness at all times of the local nature of history, how the specificities of time and place help determine what Dionysius wrote. And this is very different from Dionysius' own time travel, which in terms of modern historical thought seems, as David was pointing out, outrageously presentist. Proclus, on whom Dionysius draws extensively, could kind of do for first century Greek wisdom. Okay, well, I'm going to be first century now, so here's some Proclus. And the gulf between Dionysius' now in which he wrote and the then from which he wrote was like nothing. It could easily be crossed. There's just an easy interchange between Dionysius' present and the present 500 years ago that he's inhabiting. That's just not available to Charles. He can't work like that. He has to work much more laboriously in a certain kind of way. All sorts of opportunities are lost to him, as it were, as a result of the gulf that he has to cross, a different kind of gulf. Charles's time travel, therefore, is tinged with tragedy, and Dionysius is richly comic. An ecstatic possibility is open to Dionysius that is almost closed, although it's damn nearly there in the final sentences to Charles. Final sentence is the other place you can put things, actually. So there's a sense in which, if you do see the project of this book as to overcome a kind of historical divide, then all the project can do at the end is tragically confess that it has failed, which might turn out to be another apophatic gesture, I suppose, in its own right. Because although I'm not a deep believer in historiographic models which insist on epistemic breaks, if there has been an epistemic break, of some sort of crisis in the relation between the present and the past in Western culture. It's happened within the last 150 or so years, and we are the inheritors, above all, of that break and that crisis. And so, to the extent that this is a book attempting to undo that break, then it cannot, in some way, succeed. And all it can do is work with and mediate that break. And it's so interesting that pseudo, therefore, is the center of this book, rather than the thing that's trying to be pushed away. I have a few other things to think about, and I'm not sure if they're worth raising at this point. But I guess it is worth perhaps saying one or two things about this. The protocol that I think that gives authenticity, authority, and deep interest to a book of this kind is the protocol that insists on the local, on local conditions. A sophisticated analysis of what words meant at particular moments, of who said what to whom exactly when, of how manuscripts appear, of how texts are circulated. These are all vital to our own sense of inhabiting authoritatively some moment in the past. If we'd been reading Dennis with Julian of Norwich, we wouldn't have worried about any of those things. We would have worried about the authority, the truth of specific statements, specific narratives, and that kind of thing. Instead, we worry about these other things. We don't have the opportunity, even if we should want it, and we probably should try not to want the opportunity, to work in a kind of quasi-medieval way on these materials. But I do think that it's worth taking a careful look at the emphasis on the local. That's very productive in a book like this, and in some ways forms the authority of a book like this, because it's also potentially a limiting condition to how a book of this kind, how the insights of a book of this kind can travel beyond the local. So my thought about this is that there are ways in which we should credit the inhabitors of the Dionysian tradition for the 1,000 years or so of its kind of strongest dwelling between the 6th century and maybe the 16th century. We should credit them. We should credit them with understanding Dionysius in ways that are not the same as how we understand them, but that might have their own kind of authenticity. We should credit them, in other words, with the possibility of contiguity with, similarity to Dionysius. And so when I think of Julian as wanting to inhabit the past of Christ's passion, which he says very explicitly, in some ways that's very different from, I think, from Dionysius wanting to be a first century Athenian. In other ways, I think it's not that different, and it's worth thinking about the ways in which these similarities are available as well as differences. I wanted to end by telling in a way, a silly story from right at the end of the period where that I know about, from the middle of the 15th century, which sort of exemplifies really a startling set of similarities between the way a 15th century person might think and a 5th century person might think, but is also getting close to how we might think at the same time. This is a story that John Capgrave tells. You wouldn't have heard of John Capgrave necessarily, but it's a story he tells about Catherine of Alexandria, that great fictitious woman, a virgin martyr from the early church. Capgrave was an Augustinian hermit living in the east of England in about the 1430s and 40s, a very fine poet. And his great work was a huge sort of epic treatment of Catherine of Alexandria. He made up a lot of his facts. He had a couple of sources, and he wanted to work this thing as big as he could. In fact, what he does is he's trying to produce a hagiographic answer to Chaucer. And it's actually a damn good poem and well worth people looking at. How does he produce this story? The key thing about a hagiographic narrative is that it has to represent the saint, has to make the saint live again. The key thing about a 15th century poem is that it has to be new. It has to generate a kind of sense of its own innovativeness and vigor? How do you cross that particular divide between those two positions? Capgrave does this in his prologue by inventing a series of incidents that he knows we won't believe, but that nonetheless do this crossing work. He claims to have found the source for his very wonderful poem. It's got the greatest mystical union with Jesus scene in Book 3, which is the equivalent of the erotic bedroom scene in Chaucer's Troilus and Crusade. It's got wonderful things going on in it. From a priest from St. Pancras, he says, which is not yet a railway station in northern London, but a parish. Now, this priest was obsessed with St. Catherine, as well he might be. She's a fascinating figure. And he decides at a certain time that he's going to try to find the authentic story of not just her death, but her life as well. The problem with virgin martyrs is that we know all about how they die, but we tend not to know too much about how they lived beforehand. And to help him with this endeavor, he had a dream sent to him by God, in which not surprisingly, he's given a book to eat, and it's either bitter in his mouth or and sweet in his stomach, or the other way around, and I can never remember. And in this dream, he's told to go to Cyprus, which he does. He picks up and goes to Cyprus, and there he has another dream, which tells him that he has to dig in a certain field. The field is flowery, it's a beautiful meadow, and it's clearly a literary field. It's the field of letters in some sort of way. It turns out, though, that it's not the field of letters. It's the field where the 300 years after Athanasius' life of Catherine of Alexandria had been translated into Latin, some people fearful of persecution had buried the one authentic copy of the life of Catherine. The priest triumphantly brought it back, translated it into a dialect of English that Capgrave tells us we don't want to know about, and then left it to Capgrave so Capgrave could produce his poem. Now, this is a story about a forgery in a certain kind of way. It's a story which knows that. It's a story that knows that we're going to know. Somehow, if it's only 600 years old, you can tell that. You can tell that as you read it. But it's also a story which I think is really enacting the same kind of attempt to bridge the past and the present that's there in the Dionysius story, and is there another, not completely unrelated way in Charles's book. It reminds me a lot of the great Vision of Paul forgery story, which I'd love to hear you talk about. Remember, the Vision of Paul turns up in 397 when some people, so the preface says, dig under Paul's house in Tarsus. They're building a motorway or something like that. And they dig under Paul's house and they discover a sealed box, which they, of course, take to the emperor. And in that they find the Vision of Paul, which is the story of what really happened when he went to the third heaven, and, authenticating detail, his sandals. It's the sandals I very badly want. So to me, that's actually a 14th century story, but it happens to come from the late 4th century. That's a story which actually problematizes pseudonymity again in some way to me. There's so many authenticating devices that I'm not quite sure what to make of it. But I think I should stop because I'm wittering at this point. Time travel.
So grateful to our two discussants, and now we'll give Charles a chance to respond to them briefly, and then we'll open it for discussion. And as always, we'll be done by 7.
I'm going to try and be brief so as to save room for other questions. But thank you both. Those were very interesting and, frankly, very difficult responses. Difficult because they are so rich. So, and I'm not going to respond to all the pieces of either of your talks. I would say, David, in response to your question, your hypothesis, I think you're right. I think you're very much right that the self in Dionysius, the self that's unsaid, is a self of location. And perhaps for some of the people here who aren't familiar with Dionysius, and I didn't give a good background to this, Dionysius coins the term hierarchy and is regarded by many, and I think in many ways this is indisputable, as a deeply conservative thinker, precisely because he regards every Christian's task is to remain precisely where they are on the hierarchy. there's almost no attention given to movement in the hierarchy. But the idea is precisely that if you stay where you are, something can move through you. So you have to be fixed in order to be moved, in a sense. But being moved is as David put nicely, to be essentially a conduit or a vessel. That's another way of saying that I agree with your characterization of selfhood and Dionysius as unlike these more familiar cousins like Augustine and Bruce Springsteen and Hedvig as well. That is, the markers of selfhood, the idiotes, the individuality, are there precisely so as to be overcome. They are just as language is there, is given precisely so as to be overcome. I don't know that I can on the spot think about how Dionysius's notion of selfhood relates to structuralist and post-structuralist understandings of the selfhood. But I will say, I do think that among the people who, the person who I think has written enigmatically but most insightfully about apophasis and the multiplicity of, or the proliferation of the self is actually Derrida in something called Sauf le Nom, a short but very difficult essay of his. So that's something to pursue. Nicholas, wow, that was quite a challenge. When you said time travel, I wasn't expecting you to turn it on me. No, it's a very fair question you ask. What sort of apophasis do we perform by trying to sort of inhabit and overcome what you were calling critical historiography, right, or positivist scholarship? I don't know that I can answer this particularly well. Certainly, my having said at the beginning of this that negative theology delivered credible Christianity to me was quite a confessional statement. And you're quite right. I think most readers, close readers, will find that there are moments in the book where that seems to break through, especially near the end. Is that tragic? Is that tragic? That's the question. What I might say, so your characterization of this apophasis is that we are subordinating the present and its purposes to the past and its purposes. I think that there's some truth to that. However, these moments in the book where something else seems to break through, the more confessional or devotional, it seems to me actually where it's by subordinating the present and its purposes and appreciating the past and its purposes that I can actually sort of retrieve or reclaim the present and its purposes. So the book is an instance of, I think, a very much an inchoate project of retrieval. And to speak of retrieval raises interesting questions. What are you retrieving and for whom? And in what idiom? And is it a clean retrieval in the way that one might think retrieval would be prior to critical scholarship? I think certainly not. I'm not sure I think it's tragic. But it's certainly troubled, and I would say also that part of the kind of mongrel nature of that in my own book is that, this was a dissertation, and it has to serve. It's a revised dissertation, which I'm embarrassed to say. Not that it's revised, but it's probably better for having been revised. But it is written in such a way as to attempt to please those who value good critical scholarship, historiographical, positive scholarship, and not lose them at the very least, and yet let something of another investment in this material break through at moments. But it's not explicit, it's not theorized, it's not framed as such, it's just sort of smuggled in, or it's actually not so deliberate on my part as to say smuggling. It's actually just sort of the way I think, and it sort of finds its way onto the page. But I don't know whether going forward, working on these same ancient materials, I will be as responsible. That is to say, that the sort of tone of the last paragraph may actually creep forward earlier to the book, into another book. I'm wrestling with this right now because the material I'm looking at for the second book is very much, the majority of work on it is, of course, critical scholarship, primarily interested in assessing this stuff in its own local context, and at the same time I'm actually quite interested in it for some other reasons. So I have that to negotiate. But I'll stop there and open it up to other questions.